They don't want you to hear this. Because once you hear the truth, there's no going back. They say this crisis is about drugs, that it's about bad choices, weakness, people who just couldn't get it together. That's the lie they need you to believe. The truth? This crisis was designed, not by accident, not by chance, but by a system that profits off suffering and death. This is Detoxing the Discourse. Welcome to Detoxing Discourse, where we confront the narratives that have failed us and amplify the truths that can set us free. Today's episode pulls no punches. This isn't a history lesson for the sake of reflection. It's a reckoning. Foundations of a Crisis is the untold, uncomfortable, undeniable story of how British Columbia became the epicenter of a toxic drug crisis that continues to devastate lives and rip apart communities. We'll strip back every layer, from colonial conquest to policy failure, and expose how addiction in BC isn't about bad choices. It's about bad systems, built on stolen land, fueled by racist laws, and maintained through calculated neglect. Let's begin. Part 1. The seeds of displacement, colonialism, cultural erasure, and economic exploitation. Colonial invasion and cultural violence. Before the first settler ever set foot on these lands, the territory we now call British Columbia was a rich tapestry of Indigenous life. Interconnected nations with complex governance, deep ceremonial traditions, diverse languages, and sustainable economies rooted in reciprocity. There were no jails, no child apprehension systems, no addiction crises. People lived in balance with each other and with the land, because the land was family. This wasn't primitive, it was sophisticated. Advanced systems of governance and justice existed through hereditary leadership, consensus building, oral law, and ceremonial accountability. Healing was community-driven. Medicines were harvested responsibly. Children were taught to know who they were, where they came from, and who they belonged to. That is wellness. And then colonization came, not as a slow, reluctant encroachment, but as a deliberate, violent, and strategic assault. Starting in the late 1700s, British and European traders arrived under the banners of empire and profit. The Hudson Bay Company established fur trading posts that quickly became outposts of conquest. Settler colonial expansion, backed by British imperialism, swept across the land, claiming territory that was never ceded, never surrendered, and never sold. Let's be clear. British Columbia is still unceded land. No treaties, no consent, no justice. By the mid-1800s, smallpox, spread deliberately in some regions through infected blankets, had decimated Indigenous population. Oral histories describe settlers watching villages die, then moving into state claim. Thousands of lives lost. Entire nations reduced to a fraction of their populations, not by accident, by design. Then came the Indian Act of 1876, a legal weapon of assimilation and control. It stripped Indigenous people of their sovereignty, reduced their status to wards of the state, and imposed foreign governance systems that criminalized their existence. It outlawed Indigenous laws and ceremonies. It defined who was Indian and who was not. It empowered the state to ban movement, dismantle traditional governments, and take children away. The reserve system, often mistaken for generosity, was nothing more than a tool of containment. Indigenous peoples were herded onto small, often uninhabitable parcels of land, their movements controlled by Indian agents. You needed written permission to leave your reserve, to sell your fish, to buy livestock. This is apartheid. And while Indigenous people were being stripped of everything, settlers were being offered land for free. This wasn't just dispossession. It was economic genocide. When they started colonizing this land, they went in groups and they would as far as you could walk, if you could farm and make something of that land, you got as much land as far as you could walk. And so Western forest products or timber west, they had groups of people walking one after the other, and that's why they have so much land. Potlatch ban, 1884 to 1951, criminalized the very heart of coastal Indigenous culture. The potlatch was more than a feast. It was a legal, spiritual, and economic system of redistribution and accountability. To ban it was to dismantle Indigenous systems of law and wellness. Arrests were made, sacred regalia was confiscated and shipped to museums. Imagine outlawing generosity, outlawing healing. But that wasn't enough. Colonizers didn't just want the land, they also came for the children. Residential schools, state-sanctioned kidnapping. From the 1880s to the late 1900s, over 150,000 Indigenous children across Canada were forcibly removed from their families and placed in church-run residential schools. In BC alone, there were at least 18 such institutions. These were not schools. They were prisons for children run by clergy and funded by the state. Children were beaten for speaking their language. Girls were raped by priests. Boys were forced into slave labor. Hundreds, likely thousands, died from abuse, neglect, and disease. In fact, half of those children never came home, and their parents were never told. This was not a tragic mistake. This is a policy of cultural extermination. As Duncan Campbell Scott, a senior Indian Affairs official, said in 1920, our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. This was genocide. The 60s scoop followed from the 1950s to the 1980s. Tens of thousands of Indigenous children were apprehended by child welfare agencies and placed in non-Indigenous homes. Many were adopted internationally. Many were abused. Most lost all connection to their families, languages, and culture, and it didn't stop there. The Millennial Scoop continues the cycle today. Indigenous children make up over 60% of kids in care in British Columbia, despite representing less than 10% of the population. The system is still taking children, still breaking families, still setting the stage for trauma, addiction, and incarceration. This isn't history. This is now. This isn't neglect. This is policy. These aren't tragic consequences. These are colonial objectives. And if you would like a few sources on that information, you can go to Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Final Report 2015, and National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Final Report 2019. Loss of land equals loss of medicine. This land is not a backdrop. It is a pharmacy, a teacher, a therapist, a relative. When land was stolen, so too were the medicines that sustained Indigenous life. Cedar bark to treat infections, devil's club for the pain, salmon for strength, smoke houses, sweat lodges, cold water, and ceremony. All of it, integral to wellness, were either banned, polluted, or made inaccessible. Colonialism didn't just steal the land, it replaced it with trauma. Rivers were dammed, forests clear-cut, and food systems destroyed. Fish stocks collapsed under commercial greed. Poison swept into watersheds. Indigenous people whose health had always been tied to the land were cut off from what made them whole. In this void, pain grew. With no access to traditional healing, many turned to the only medicine available, alcohol, then prescription drugs, then street supply. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This was trauma seeking release. This was grief without ceremony. This was disconnection from culture and kin turned inward. When you outlaw identity, remove children, and poison the land, what emerges is not addiction. What emerges is a predictable consequence of a system built to break people. And when those people seek help, they are too often met with not compassion, but with criminalization, judgment, and shame. This is the foundation of the crisis we face today. Part 2, Building the Cage, Institutional Neglect and Criminalization. The war on drugs was always a war on people. The foundations of Canada's drug laws were never about public health. They were about control. The first so-called drug crisis in BC wasn't rooted in overdose deaths. It was rooted in white fear of Chinese laborers in 1908. After a series of moral panics and racially charged riots in Vancouver, the federal government passed the Opium Act. The target? Chinese-run opium dens. The goal? Racial exclusion and social control. White users were largely ignored. Chinese workers were criminalized, surveilled, and scapegoated. This was the blueprint. In 1923, cannabis was added to Canada's list of banned substances without parliamentary debate, scientific evidence, or public health justification. It was quietly slipped in amid a wave of xenophobia and anti-Black sentiment, alongside a broader push to erase Indigenous ways of being. Meanwhile, white Canadians openly access morphine, laudanum, and barbiturates through pharmacies and physicians. Addiction was seen as a moral failing in racialized communities and a medical condition in white ones. From its inception, the war on drugs has been a war on the poor, the racialized, and the dispossessed. The criminalization of substance use was never neutral. It was, and remains, profoundly political. Policing replaced care, prisons replaced healing, and Indigenous people bore the brunt. The overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's correctional system is not an accident. It's an outcome of colonially rooted policy choices. We were never meant to survive in these systems. This wasn't about drugs, it was about erasure, about control, about building cages instead of bridges, healthcare designed to exclude. Colonialism didn't just displace Indigenous peoples from land, it dislocated them from care. The healthcare system in BC, like the rest of Canada, was never designed to serve Indigenous bodies, minds, or spirits. It was built on principles of assimilation, institutional power, and biomedical supremacy, and it still carries that legacy today. For decades, detox facilities operated on a single rigid model. Abstinence only. No room for cultural practices, no room for nuance, no room for choice. Harm reduction was dismissed as enabling, and traditional healing was dismissed as superstition. The result? Indigenous people were either forced to conform or left behind. Hospitals were, and still are, spaces of trauma. Stories of being turned away, over-policed, or misdiagnosed because of substance use or race are not exceptions, they are systemic norms. Many Indigenous people in crisis still choose to stay in alleyways or tents rather than risk entering an emergency room. That choice isn't about defiance, it's about survival. The 2020 death of Joyce Echaquan, a 37-year-old Atikamekw woman who live-streamed the racist abuse she endured from hospital staff moments before her death, was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror held up to a nation, and it reflected what many Indigenous families have always known. The systems meant to heal us are often the ones that harm us the most. You can't access care in a system that criminalizes your coping. You can't heal in a structure that denies your humanity. Fear of the system equals death on the streets. In the middle of BC's toxic drug crisis, where over 14,000 lives have been lost since 2016, fear of the system is deadly. People don't call 911. They don't go to detox. They don't show up at hospitals, not because they want to die, but because too many times they've walked into those places and come out more broken than before. The cage is both literal and invisible. It's prison cells and journeys. It's discriminatory policies and racist assumptions. It's a system that responds to trauma with tasers, to addiction with handcuffs, to Indigenous suffering with silence. We cannot talk about substance use without naming the systems that criminalize and neglect. We cannot pretend the crisis started with fentanyl when it started with land theft, child removal, and racist policy. We cannot build solutions until we tear down the cage. Part 3, the birth of a crisis, policy failure, and the rise of toxic supply. Austerity and abandonment, the 1990s. The toxic drug crisis didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was manufactured by decades of political choices rooted in disposability, stigma, and systemic neglect. In the 1990s, BC's government made brutal cuts to the very systems designed to protect life. Social assistance rates were slashed. Mental health care was gutted. Psychiatric hospitals were downsized under the banner of deinstitutionalization, but community-based services were never properly funded to replace them. The result? Thousands of people with complex trauma, mental health issues, and substance use needs were pushed out alone, unsupported, onto the streets of Nanaimo, Victoria, and Vancouver's downtown east side. At the same time, affordable housing began to disappear. Public housing wasn't expanded. Rent control was weakened. Speculators and developers were prioritized over people. The most vulnerable were pushed into survival mode. And while communities were being hollowed out, the federal government doubled down on prohibition. In 1996, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act was introduced, embedding criminalization even deeper into federal law. Health took a backseat to punishment. Surveillance replaced care. This left a deadly void. People were struggling, but systems refused to show up. So the underground drug market did. You can't cut people off from housing, mental health care, and income, and then blame them for surviving. This is the origin story of the crisis, not just fentanyl, not just heroin, but the collapse of care and the criminalization of pain. From heroin to fentanyl, the shift to toxic supply. By the early 2000s, global heroin markets began to shift. Afghanistan's poppy production became unstable due to war, conflict, and disruption of trade routes. In that gap, synthetic opioids began to emerge, cheaper, more potent, and easier to traffic. Enter fentanyl. By 2014, fentanyl had already started to contaminate BC's drug supply. By 2016, the province declared a public health emergency. But it wasn't just heroin anymore. Fentanyl and its analogs were being cut into everything. Cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, fake benzos, and even crack. People weren't just overdosing, they were being poisoned. Instantly, unknowingly. This wasn't about using too much. This was about using anything and dying anyways. And let's tell the truth without apology. If this had been happening in Kerrisdale, Oak Bay, or West Vancouver, the response would have been immediate, massive, and compassionate. Instead, it happened in alleys, shelters, reserves, motels, and low-income apartments, so the system shrugged. This isn't a crisis because people are dying. It's a crisis because of who's dying and how little that seems to matter. The poison drug supply is not the result of individual choices. It's a result of structural abandonment. We have a toxic supply because we force people into a toxic economy. We criminalize survival, then let people die. Even after 14,000 deaths in BC alone, we're still debating whether people who use drugs deserve care. Part 4. The ongoing failure, stigma, silence, and resistance. Still no safe supply. It is 25, and we are still waiting for the full implementation of safe supply. We've heard the promises, the task force, and the pilot programs, but the truth remains. Safe supply isn't accessible to those who need it the most. The programs that do exist are often too limited, overly medicalized, and clogged with bureaucratic red tape. People who use drugs are still being forced to buy from the same toxic street supply they've been trying to escape for decades. In 2023 alone, 2,511 people died from toxic drugs in British Columbia. More than 6 people every single day. Each death was a human being, a person with a family, a story that will never be told in the halls of government, in the media, or the sterile rooms of policymakers. Each one had a name, a history, and a community that will mourn their absence. We are left with these staggering statistics, yet the solution, the implementation of a safe, regulated supply of drugs, remains inaccessible to many. It's not that the answers haven't been presented, it's that the systems that be are not prioritizing lives. They are prioritizing their power, their rhetoric, and their selective empathy. The government and policymakers are letting people die, and it's not a crisis of the streets, it's a crisis of policy. Stigma is policy. Stigma is no longer just an individual's internal struggle, it has become policy. It's baked into the very fabric of how we treat those who use drugs. The media continues to push the narrative of personal responsibility, focusing on the choices of individuals while completely ignoring the web of historical, economic, and systemic violence that has led to the toxic drug crisis. Politicians, disconnected from the lived experience, still posture about cleaning up the streets as if these deaths are some kind of social nuisance to be swept away. But let's be clear, the problem isn't the people. The problem is the system that continues to stigmatize people for their survival strategies. It's a system that insists on punishment over compassion, criminalization over care, and the silence over truth. Even the services that exist, detox centers, treatment programs, are overwhelmingly built around the notion of abstinence, not autonomy. They don't focus on harm reduction, they focus on control. But the truth is, autonomy is the key. People need control over their own healing. The rigidity of abstinence-only models forces people into dangerous situations, back into the streets, and back to the toxic supply. And perhaps most disturbing of all, some communities, still gripped by outdated ideologies, are actively pushing to shut down overdose prevention sites. These sites aren't just places for people to use safely, they are lifelines. They are saving lives, one witness consumption at a time. But they continue to be treated like some form of social contagion. The fight to maintain them isn't ignorance, it's intentional. It is willful disregard for the lives that hang in the balance. It is a choice to leave people to die. If we can't guarantee life, why should anyone believe in the system that kills them? The message here is clear. People who use drugs are not just being failed by the system. They are actively being punished by it. It's no longer accidental. It's not some administrative oversight. It's deliberate failure, rooted in deep-seated disregard for the most vulnerable. Part 5, the path forward, truth, culture, and community-led change. We know what works, so why aren't we doing it? The evidence is not just clear, it's undeniable. We know what works. Safe supply saves lives. Every study, every survivor, every community on the front lines of this crisis has shown us that safe, regulated access to the substances people use can prevent death, reduce harm, and improve quality of life. Yet we still have people dying every day from drugs that could be regulated if only the political will existed to make it happen. Peer-led outreach builds trust. Those closest to the pain know the best solutions. Peer-led outreach isn't just about handing out supplies, it's about relationship building. It's about offering support without judgment and meeting people where they are. People who use drugs trust their peers, and it's this trust that fosters healing and connection. We need to expand these programs, not limit them. Cultural reconnection heals trauma. For Indigenous peoples, healing isn't just about stopping substance use, it's about reconnecting with culture, identity, and land. It's about repairing the spiritual, emotional, and cultural damage caused by generations of violence and oppression. True healing is cultural, and it can't be delivered from the outside in. It has to be led from within, by the people whose lives and stories have been disregarded for so long. Housing is harm reduction. When people are homeless, the crisis isn't just about their addiction, it's about survival. Safe, stable housing is not a luxury, it's a fundamental need. When people have a place to call home, they can focus on healing and reclaiming their lives. Housing is not an afterthought, it's a cornerstone of harm reduction. Decriminalization works, but only if it's implemented with equity, not fear. We know that decriminalizing drug use reduces overdose deaths and criminal justice involvement, but this can only be effective if it's done with a focus on equity. It can't be a token gesture. It needs to be accompanied by meaningful harm reduction and support systems that prioritize the lives of those most impacted by this crisis, including Indigenous people of color and people who are homeless or living with mental health challenges. What we need isn't more task forces. We need radical reallocation of power. This isn't about more committees, more studies, or more task forces. It's about radical reallocation of power that's been concentrated in institutions that have failed us time and time again. We need to give that power back to the people, especially those who have been harmed the most by these systems. This means Indigenous-led health systems, peer-led harm reduction, and long-term investment in healing, not punishment. Indigenous communities should be leading the way in designing health systems that center culture, healing, and sovereignty. Peer-led harm reduction programs should be funded and expanded, not tokenized and limited by bureaucratic red tape. And instead of pouring more resources into punitive measures, we need long term investment in people, in community, and in the creation of systems that are rooted in care, respect, and justice. I'm not neutral. I've lived this. I've lost people. I've rebuilt my life from the ashes of colonial violence and systemic neglect. And I know this: addiction is not the crisis, the systems are. The truth is ugly, it's brutal. It's the kind of truth that makes people uncomfortable, but it's also liberating. Because once we see the roots of this crisis, we can pull them up. We can tear down the systems that have failed us, and we can plant something new, something just, something compassionate, something that centers the voices and needs of those who have been silenced for far too long. This is Detoxing the Discourse.
Saving you apart, we'll go, but you know I think of you. Swimming through the ocean, keep on, we know that you know I think of you. Drop